Hello class, this is Dr. Anderson and we are finishing up reproduction by talking about female reproduction. So here are our learning objectives. We want to talk about the structures of the ovary that are important for reproduction, namely the follicle and the corpus luteum, and those are parts that make hormones and make the egg. Now, egg is a very umbrella term. There are more specific ways to talk about the oocyte, but primary oocyte, secondary oocyte, or an ovum. So egg can apply to any of those stages, and hopefully I'll make that clear as we go along. Females are more complicated in terms of their reproduction because negative and positive feedback is involved in the regulation of female sex hormones. And females have two sex hormones, the progestins, the most common form being progesterone, and the estrogens, the most common form being estradiol. And so something we need to talk about as we discuss the menstrual cycle, there are things going on in the ovaries, there are things going on in the uterus, there are things going on with hormone secretion, there are things going on with cervical mucus, and all of those things are happening together. So I want you to think about how to integrate all of that. Sometimes during the menstrual cycle, there is no ovulation. We want to talk about why that might be, and we want to finish up by talking about oral contraceptives. So here's a side view of the female reproductive tract. So notice that females have a separate opening for the reproductive tract from the urinary tract. Remember, males are sharing this long urethra. Females have a shorter urethra, makes them vulnerable to bladder infections more so than males. And then here's the vagina. There's the cervix. The opening in the cervix is called the os. There's the lumen of the uterus. Most of the uterus is the smooth muscle myometrium. If we look at a frontal view, again, here's the vagina, the cervix, the opening is called the os, the lumen of the uterus, and then there are tubes called fallopian tubes that branch on either side. What's kind of amazing here is the fallopian tubes open right up into the abdominal cavity. So potentially a pathogen could travel through the reproductive tract and actually make its way into the abdominal cavity. That is an anatomical vulnerability of females. So females host a population of friendly bacteria that take glycogen and break it down into an acid. So the vagina is an acidic environment. That's important to protect the female system. And of course, as we learned previously, males then have evolved an alkaline sperm. They add bicarbonate to the semen in order to combat this vaginal acid. Here's the primary reproductive organ, the ovary. It's got two jobs, to make sex hormones and to make oocytes. So in the embryo, the female ovaries have a bunch of stem cells. Those stem cells are called oogonia. After the 9th week, then females are going to, embryos then called a fetus. So these oogonia undergo mitotic division. Notice how this is different from males. Males don't start dividing their spermatogonia until puberty. Females are doing this in the embryo and fetus. So at birth, a little baby girl has 2 to 4 million oocytes in her ovaries. Maybe 400 will be ovulated over her lifespan, so then females run out of oocytes and they progress into through a process called menopause, and then their fertility is ended. That's different than males. Males potentially could be fertile for the rest of their life. So the traditional view is that all the stem cells in a fetal girl enter meiosis. The chromosomes are replicated, the chromosomes condense and line up in homologous pairs on the metaphase plate, and they all go into meiosis and then they stop. and there are no remaining stem cells. Well, this doesn't seem to be the case. So stem cells have been found in the ovary. Now, women still go through menopause. I don't know what the consequences of having these stem cells are, but cellular biology is just totally changed in terms of the way we think about stem cells. We used to think there are no stem cells in the brain. Well, guess what? There are stem cells. And that there were no stem cells in muscle cells. Well, guess what? They're satellite cells that are kind of stem cells. So we have to rethink this. I don't know what the consequences are, but our traditional view is changing. All right, so here's what a follicle looks like. So we start out with a little primordial follicle. There's an oocyte with just a layer of cells around it. Those cells are called granulosa cells, and those are the cells that make estrogen. So this oocyte continues to grow, add cytoplasm with its layer around, and then the layers around the oocyte grow as well. The granulosa cells develop, and then there's an outer layer called the theca cells. And notice as the follicle grows, there's a little cavity that's formed called the antrum. And then when you have a mature follicle, there's a layer of granulosa cells. There's a layer of theca cells. What's the importance of that? Well, the theca cells actually make an androgen that diffuses into the granulosa cells, and the granulosa cells have an enzyme called aromatase. Do you remember when we talked about that way back when in our first lecture? Aromatase converts testosterone into estradiol. So the androgen is converted into estradiol, and then the granulosa cells produce a lot of that estrogen. Notice this big cavity that is formed. So we have a structure that's ready to be ovulated, and it's just the oocyte and the layer of granulosa cells around the oocyte that will be ovulated. All of these cells will stay in the ovary and will differentiate into a different structure we call the corpus luteum. So we have the two-celled theory of the production of estrogen. LH works on the theca cells. The theca cells make an androgen. Those diffuse over to the granulosa cells, and with the help of FSH, make estrogens. Now, meiosis is a process that occurs in females as well. There's some little differences. So, in the fetus are the oogonia. They undergo mitotic differentiation. Most of the cells then differentiate into primary oocytes, and then they stop. The baby girl is born, she goes through childhood, and it isn't until she starts puberty that this process will start up again. So there will be a meiotic division. Notice all the cytoplasm goes to one cell, and simply a remnant of the nucleus is cast off. We call that a polar body. Now, this is the cell that's ovulated. Then with fertilization, there is a second meiotic division. Again, the genetic material is cast off, and now we have a mature haploid cell. This is the cell that fuses with the sperm and becomes a zygote. So notice, one spermatogonium results in 4 sperm. In the female, one oogonium results in 1 ovum. So what happens in the ovary over the course of the menstrual cycle? The beginning of the cycle, FSH is high. FSH is high because estrogen and progesterone are low. So FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone. It was named for the function it produces in females. So what do you think it does? Follicle stimulating hormone stimulates follicles. So a few ovarian follicles will develop and will continue in meiosis. The follicular cells start to produce estrogen, and that estrogen feeds back and inhibits FSH. But about day 7 of a 28-day cycle, one follicle emerges as the chosen one. That's the dominant follicle. Other follicles, they may stop and wait till the next cycle, but a lot of the follicles just degenerate. If the cycle's 28 days, ovulation is going to occur around day 14. And what's left of the follicle, because remember, just the inside, just the oocyte with a layer of cells is going to be ovulated. The rest is going to stay in the ovary. That remnant of the follicle is acted upon by luteinizing hormone, and that structure becomes the corpus luteum. Corpus luteum stands for yellow body. The corpus luteum then lasts about 14 days. When the corpus luteum dies, its ability to produce hormone dies. The endometrium sheds and we start all over again. So in terms of the ovaries, the first half of the cycle is the follicular phase. The follicle is growing. Now, in case you didn't know, the first day of the menstrual cycle is the first day of bleeding. So when bleeding starts, it's because estrogen and progesterone are low. FSH goes up and starts stimulating those follicles. At around day 14, depending on how long the cycle is, there's ovulation. What's left of the follicle is acted upon by luteinizing hormone, and then the remainder of the cycle is the luteal phase, and the corpus luteum produces estrogen and progesterone. Now, not all cycles are 28 days. In fact, probably most cycles are not 28 days. They're just all over the place. But the variability tends to be in the follicular phase. So let me get back to where I wanted to be. So this follicular phase can vary in length. The luteal phase tends to be around 14 days. So ovulation is going to take place basically about 14 days from the end of the cycle. So knowing that, the luteal phase is much less variable. So if I told you there was a woman who has a 31-day cycle, on what day is ovulation most likely to occur? So you think about that for yourself, and we'll talk about that in class. So what's happening in the uterus the same time the ovaries are doing their thing? Well, the first few days are the menstrual phase. Because estrogen and progesterone are low, the endometrium is not supported and it sheds. As the follicle grows, then the follicle starts to produce estrogen. Estrogen works on the endometrium and causes it to grow. So an increased number of cells, we call that proliferation. So then that is called the proliferative phase of the uterus. So the menstrual phase and proliferative phase is occurring at the same time as the follicular phase. Then about day 14, there's going to be ovulation. And then there's the development of the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is going to make a hormone called progesterone. So progesterone really is made in high levels in the second half of the cycle. Progesterone is going to cause the differentiation or the specialization of the endometrium. And what happens is the endometrium is literally turned into a gland, and that gland stores and secretes glycogen. Now, why would we want to store glycogen in the endometrium? Because in case there's a fertilization, that embryo is going to implant, and that embryo has to have food to live on while the placenta is being developed. So here's a figure that tries to put a number of things together. Here's a follicle. Notice the endometrium is shedding, so we're in the menstrual phase, but the follicles are developing because FSH is high. As the follicle develops, about day 7, we get a dominant follicle. It puts out a lot of estrogen. That estrogen causes the endometrium to grow during the proliferative phase. And that follicle continues to develop, and it's going to put out a lot of estrogen. which is going to be the signal for ovulation. It's much more complicated than that, so hang on. I'll get into that in a bit. So the follicle releases the secondary oocyte. Now your textbook says this is an ovum. That's a mistake. This is a secondary oocyte. The follicle that's left behind is turned into a corpus luteum by luteinizing hormone. So not only do we produce estrogen, but we produce progesterone, and that causes the specialization and the secretory phase. So secretory phase and the luteal phase are happening together. Now, I don't know why this happens, but after about, 11, 12 days, this thing starts to degenerate. And it degenerates and basically turns into a little scar called the corpus albicans. It no longer produces hormones, and if we don't have estrogen and progesterone, then the endometrial lining sheds and we start the next cycle. I like to put things in tables, so here's another way to think about it. If we have a 28-day cycle, day 1 to 5 is the follicular phase, while the menstrual phase is going on. Because estrogen and progesterone are low, FSH is high. As the follicle grows, the production of estrogen allows for the proliferative phase. About day 14 will be ovulation. It's hard to say, the uterus doesn't immediately go from a proliferative to a secretory phase. There's a 24-hour period where that has to kind of convert. But ovulation is occurring because of a spike or a big surge in a hormone called LH, and we'll get to that soon. The luteal phase is the last half of the cycle. So the corpus luteum is producing progesterone. That progesterone allows for the differentiation of the endometrium so that there's a nice cushy place full of nutrition for an embryo to implant, should there be a fertilization. So here we actually see the hormone secretion. So in the beginning, estrogen and progesterone levels are low. So FSH increases. As estrogen increases, then FSH is turned off. That's a really good thing because we want to develop a few follicles, but once a few follicles start to develop, we turn FSH off. We want to see what's going to happen to that handful of follicles. One emerges as the dominant follicle. It starts to put out estrogen, and it basically goes on autopilot. Some people talk about this as a positive feedback, that the follicle puts out estrogen, which tells it to put out more estrogen and more estrogen and more estrogen. And estrogen climbs and climbs and climbs, and instead of inhibiting the anterior pituitary, it stimulates it. And we get a big surge of LH. LH then is the stimulus for ovulation. Once ovulation occurs, LH goes back down. You see a decline in estrogen production. We got to make a corpus luteum. And then once the corpus luteum is functional, we see progesterone and estrogen going up again. When the corpus luteum dies, those hormones go down. There are no hormones to sustain the endometrium, and bleeding occurs. So the first part of the cycle is negative feedback. GnRH stimulates FSH and LH. FSH promotes the granulosa cells. LH give us the androgen so we can turn that into estradiol. Once the oocytes start producing, we don't want to produce any more oocytes, or we don't want to develop any more follicles. So inhibin inhibits FSH. Let's see what happens to the small number of follicles before we start developing any more. Estrogen then, of course, is used throughout the body, and it can inhibit LH and FSH and inhibit GnRH. At ovulation, the system converts to positive feedback. The hypothalamus secretes GnRH. Anterior pituitary secretes LH. Why is that? because this follicle has been producing huge amounts of estrogen. And it's like we cross a threshold. So instead of inhibiting the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus, we stimulate it. We get the LH surge, and then ovulation can occur. Remember, what's released is a secondary oocyte. To get to a mature ovum, we need to have fertilization. So here's a fun picture. This woman was having surgery for something else. The physician or the surgeon looked over and said, "Leaping lizards, get the camera. We have ovulation going on." So the follicle is ballooning out, and there's the egg to be released. So sometimes it bursts. Sometimes it takes some time for the oocyte to be squeezed out. Now, this is a dilator, and this is a hemostat. So this is like a pair of scissors. You see the tip, there's another hemostat. And to see the relative size of these structures versus the follicle. So the follicle, at ovulation is kind of a big structure. So once ovulation occurs, we go back to negative feedback. We've got a corpus luteum that's producing estrogen and progesterone and inhibin. Inhibin and progesterone are going to inhibit everything. We inhibit GnRH. We inhibit FSH and LH. Inhibin specifically works on FSH. Progesterone and estrogen are working on LH. So we're going to secrete that progesterone. We're going to differentiate that lining. We're going to see if we get a fertilization and an implantation. If not, then the corpus luteum dies and the lining is shed. Now, why do we have two kinds of feedback? Interestingly enough, there are no estrogen receptors on the GnRH-producing neurons. So how in the world is estrogen regulating them? Well, there are neurons that synapse on the estrogen, or there are neurons that synapse on the GnRH neurons, and they are the ones that have estrogen receptors. And those neurons produce a really fun peptide called kisspeptin. And we have two kinds of kisspeptin neurons. Some of them are negative feedback neurons, and some of them are positive feedback neurons. And it's the estrogen production that determines which neurons we activate. So here is a uterus and the fallopian tubes and the ovaries producing estrogen. I'm sorry that my uterus and my fallopian tubes kind of look like a bunny, but you'll just have to get over it. Here's my estrogen. Estrogen is going to start to be produced. As it is, that sort of medium levels of estrogen feedback and inhibit the negative feedback neurons. We decrease kisspeptin, we decrease GnRH, we decrease FSH and LH. But the thing is, this follicle, once it gets going, it's like it's on autopilot. And that follicle produces more and more and more and more estrogen. And finally, we get so much estrogen that we activate the positive feedback mechanisms. The positive feedback neurons produce kisspeptin. Kisspeptin stimulates GnRH, and we get a big LH spike, which leads to ovulation. Now, this has not been shown definitively in humans. It's been shown in sheep. Sheep are a pretty good reproductive animal model for humans. So I suspect this is the way it takes place in humans. We do know humans have kisspeptin. Kisspeptin seems to be involved in puberty. So two hormones. Estrogen. Estrogens cause cells to divide, promotes growth of the breast, growth of the reproductive structures, promotes ovulation and fertilization. Progestins are differentiators. The breast differentiates into a gland. The endometrium differentiates into a gland. And progestins promote implantation of pregnancy. Progesterone inhibits smooth muscle contraction, keeping the uterus as relaxed as possible to promote implantation and a stable pregnancy. Now, puberty. Around age 8, just like in the boys, the hypothalamus senses low estrogen levels. This is attributed to kisspeptin as well. It's happening in girls and boys. So kisspeptin tells the hypothalamus, wait a minute, you don't have any sex hormone. The hypothalamus realizes, oh, I don't have sex hormone. I need to start producing GnRH. So again, GnRH is the first step in puberty. We get FSH and LH, and then estrogen is produced. And estrogen causes the growth of the breasts and the genitals. So in a girl, the first sign of puberty is breast development. And as she produces estrogen, the lining of the endometrium grows, and at some point she's going to have a period, but she's probably not going to ovulate. It's because she has enough estrogen to proliferate the endometrium, but not enough estrogen to set off the positive feedback mechanism. Maybe 6 months to a year, she matures enough that she's making enough estrogen that not only does she proliferate the endometrium, but she triggers those positive feedback neurons, and she sets off that feedback for the LH spike, and now she is fertile. Now, how do hormonal contraceptive methods work? They basically inhibit ovulation. Now, combination oral contraceptives, which is a combination of estrogen and progesterone, kind of flatten out hormone secretion. If you add exogenous estrogen, that inhibits GnRH, inhibits FSH, so there's less follicle development and less endogenous estrogen being produced. If there's less endogenous estrogen being produced, there's not the big rise in estrogen. There's not a high enough estrogen level for an LH spike. If there is no LH spike, there is no ovulation, and there is no oocyte for the sperm to fertilize, and therefore there's contraception. Now, that's not the only reason why a woman might take a hormonal contraception. Some women have awful menstrual periods. They bleed so heavily that it's difficult for them to leave the house and go to school or go to their job. And so, in such a case, she might take an oral contraceptive because if endogenous levels are knocked down, there won't be as much proliferation, and her periods may be much more manageable. You know, there are discussions about whether this should be paid for by insurance, and I think it should because, and you don't have to agree with me, but I think it should. If a natural process is occurring to such an extent that you can't manage your blood flow to leave the house, that's somebody's livelihood. So, so the females in the class may have experienced this or may have a friend who have experienced this. Fellas, I want you to appreciate that this can be kind of a big deal, and to understand the sort of the feedback mechanism that explains this clinical issue. Alrighty, so I hope you're finding these recordings helpful. And whether you listen to them before class or after class, I'm happy to take your questions. I appreciate how hard you all work. I appreciate how responsive you are in class. And I look forward to seeing you in class next time. So take care, everybody.